Let's segue into zone 2, my favorite topic of all time. It's so hilarious that like zone 2 training is now like a thing that people love to talk about. Like I've been talking about this forever. I know
Phil
you
Maffetone has been talking about it under different names. Yeah.
So I cottoned on to the Maffetone method, at the beginning of my ultra endurance training. And I really credit adherence, strict adherence to that philosophy as a vehicle for me making drastic improvements over the course of three-year period. It's, this stuff doesn't happen overnight. And I'm constantly preaching the benefits of it. And it's so cool and interesting to see people experiment with it. But I think there's also a lot of confusion about what it actually is and why it's effective. So nobody is better, except for maybe Indigo. Is that how you say his name?
Indigo.
Indigo. At talking about this. So, please allow me to, indulge you in a conversation about zone 2 training.
So I agree. I wish there was a better name for it because, as you know, because you've trained with a power meter on a bike, if you're a student of, cycling power meters, we use 7 zones when we're training and cycling. And so the first thing I say to anybody who's coming to this is, please forget everything you know about your numbers and your zones. And this has nothing to do with FTP and the sort of Andrew Coggin sort of stuff. So it's just an energy system. And the way San Millán describes it is really through 5 energy systems. And zone 2 is the one that is basically defined as the maximal level of aerobic output that you can generate while keeping lactate below 2 millimole. So you could argue that's an arbitrary definition, although physiologically it turns out not to be. So what is lactate? We have to kind of explain this, I think, in some detail for people to understand why this matters. Because even though most people will do zone 2 without ever measuring their lactate, and that's fine. If you want to be really on the money, you do need to measure your lactate, at least periodically. And I do every day. I mean, I do zone 2 4 days a week. Every one of those 4 days a week, I'm measuring my lactate.
There's plenty of DIY protocols out there that vary in terms of efficacy, but I'm always encouraging people to get a proper test on a bike trainer or on a treadmill with a technician who's drawing lactate at those intervals so you can really dial in on it. And, I wrote about this in my book and I explained that the top of my zone 2 was a heart rate of like 145, I think, when I was running and 130 on a bike. And then people will tweet me and like, I'm keeping my heart rate at 145. I'm like, no, this is not what I'm saying. I expressly said, like, this is me. This is not you. You have to get a proper test to really, understand your own physiology.
Yeah. So this gets back to your question about metabolic health. Well, zone 2 in many ways is the most important functional test we have for determining a person's metabolic health. So I talk to patients about how we have dynamic and static tests for determining their health. So a static test is just a blood test where tell me what your uric acid is, your glucose, your insulin, all of these things. Your triglycerides. A dynamic test is, let me give you a bunch of glucose right now and draw your blood over time and watch what it does. Another dynamic test is, let me ask you to do work, ride a bike, run on a treadmill, and let me measure a metabolic byproduct called lactate. And that will tell me an unbelievable amount, perhaps more than anything else, about how you function. And this functional test is so important. So when our bodies create ATP, they have choices for what fuel they're going to use. So for all intents and purposes, there are 2 fuels to make ATP, glucose and fat. Now with fat, you can only do one thing with it. You can only turn fat into 2 carbon subunits that get put into the mitochondria, where you very efficiently make ATP, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. So that's why when we're, so the input is fat and oxygen, and the output is ATP, carbon dioxide, water. So we're breathing out CO2 and water vapor. We're using the ATP. We can do the same thing with glucose. Glucose can be turned from, glucose into pyruvate, and pyruvate goes into that same pathway. So glucose and fat can both be churned through that super efficient pathway to make ATP. As the body's demand for ATP grows, it's going to start outstripping the capacity of the mitochondria depending on the fitness of the individual, depending on the efficiency of the furnace. And so it does have an escape valve. It does have a manner in which it can produce more ATP absent sufficient oxygen, which is basically the thing. The utilization of oxygen becomes the bottleneck. So, but here it can't do it with fat. So once you tap out on your fat stores, you don't have a way to overspill fat oxidation into this other energy source. Instead, you turn that glucose into pyruvate, but now you turn the pyruvate into lactate. And that does yield a little bit of ATP, literally about 1/16 the ATP you would have received if you had run that glucose through the mitochondria. So that's a knock on it. That's the trade-off, is you got a fraction of the energy, but the bigger trade-off is that you're generating lactate, which now pairs with hydrogen and creates an acid. That acid effectively makes it very difficult for actin and myosin filaments to uncouple. And if that lactic acid level gets high enough, you start to really feel the inability, the burn in the muscle that creates the inability for you to continue effectively contracting your muscles. So anybody who's done an all-out effort knows exactly what that feels like.
The other variability being the exhaustibility of the energy source, right? You have something like 45 minutes worth of glucose output at that higher zone training rate, whereas your fat stores are essentially inexhaustible.
That's right.
Right. So if you can develop a vast zone 2 capacity, which essentially means being able to be incredibly metabolically efficient at a certain activity in a certain rate at a certain level of exertion, that in turn creates mitochondrial efficiency, mitochondrial density, and basically an inexhaustible source of energy to propel you through an ultra endurance event or an endurance event.
Yep. And so I thought about this a lot, obviously, when I was swimming, because even more so than cycling, fueling in really long swims, as you now know, is just, it's a grind, especially in the ocean where the salt water gets in your mouth. If you on one of my Catalina swims, I remember it was so choppy that on one breath, I turned to breathe. It was the middle of the night, so you can't see anything, and just ingested a gallon of salt water.
Nausea is a given.
Yeah, you're just puking your brains out. So, so anything you can do to minimize the requirement for having to feed the glucose engine, especially when you can't really take in a solution in excess of about 6% glucose, 60 grams per liter. You're very limited at how much glucose you can take in. So absolutely correct. Okay, so now the question becomes, what separates men from the boys? Basically, when you look at endurance sports, one of the most differentiating factors is how high is a person's zone 2 threshold. How much, let's just use cycling as an example because it's just so easy to metric. How many watts can a person generate per kilo of body weight, if we want to normalize it, while keeping lactate below 2? And what is it about that lactate below 2? If lactate stays below 2, you are at that equilibrium where we know that you are in balance. You are not net accumulating lactate yet. Once lactate gets above 2, you will begin to net accumulate lactate, meaning you will accumulate lactate quicker than you can clear it, and that now puts you in a finite strategy of activity. Now, when you and I did races and stuff like that, like when I was in a time trial, my lactate was definitely above 2. It was, I would finish a race at a lactate of 16, and probably 10 minutes before the end, my lactate was 8, and 10 minutes before that, my lactate was probably 4. So I sort of budgeted to blow up at the end of that race. But if you said to me, Peter, I want you to go out and do a 3-hour nonstop ride at your maximum, like what's the greatest distance you could cover in 3 hours? I have to keep lactate below 2. In fact, when you look at Kipchoge breaking a 2-hour marathon record, same thing. Even though he's running at a speed most of us can't run for 100 yards, for him, his lactate was below 2 to be able to do that, or else he couldn't have done that.
Yeah, it's interesting that that terminology like VO2 max gets all the attention, and in reality, it's so much less important than what your Z2 maximum is. And a question that I don't know that I've ever heard a good answer for that I'm curious about is the difference between, like, let's say the top end of your zone 2 is like, I don't know, 250 watts on a bike. What is the difference between an athlete that can maintain that 250 watts at below two for 3 hours, but then taps out, versus the athlete that can maintain that for 8 hours?
At some point it starts to become a question of like, how much fuel can they, because you're still at the 3 8-hour difference, you're going to have to start ingesting some fuel at that point.
So assume equality across fueling.
Yeah, then it probably starts to come down to muscle fibers and things like that. Like at 8 hours.
Mitochondrial density?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think I know the answer to that. I think what I would say is you're going to, because these are fit athletes, like their muscles are actually putting out a lot of power. I mean, 250 watts is a lot of power. And so I think you're now starting to get into the limitations of actual fiber damage. For example, like when people feel sore the day after a super intense workout where they had that lactate burn, I think they erroneously assume that it's the lactate that they're feeling, but they're actually not. They're feeling the microscopic damage to the muscle fibers. So I suspect that that's probably going to be the differentiating factor there. So it's some amount of muscle protein synthesis and some amount of, kind of strength that probably factors into it as well, like actual muscular strength.
I remember when I was training for my first Ultraman. Prior to that, I'd messed around in triathlon without a coach, was pretty fit in my own mind, hired a coach. He's like, I can't even tell you anything until you get a lactate test. Like, there's no point in us even talking. Like, I need you to go do this. I didn't know anything about it. And I was like, it'll be good. Like, I go in, that graph was like pathetic. I couldn't believe like how quickly I would go out of zone 2. And then my whole program was built upon, this church of zone 2, where literally for the first year, I don't think I did a single workout that was above zone 2. There was
And
no
how much did your zone
training.
2 increase during that course of the year?
Unbelievable. Like the improvement was insane.
Yeah.
And that's why I became like, I'm such an adherent and a believer in this. Without doing any threshold or tempo work whatsoever, I was able to go from somebody who couldn't run faster than 10 minutes per mile without going into zone 3 to 2 years later, being able to run like 7:15s in my zone 2 without any track work, without any threshold work, any interval work whatsoever, just by building that foundation bit by bit. And it's all about the ability to come back the next day and the next day and the next day. And I think there's something about that consistency such that when you develop that robustness and you do have an effort, let's say you're attacking a hill or whatever, and you're way out of your zone 2 to do so, you come back down to that baseline zone 2 very quickly, as opposed to like, being winded for an extended period of time and kind of losing pace as a result.
Yeah. So when we put our patients through CPET testing, we have about a 4-page dashboard that we run them through, which is much more extensive than just, we show you your VO2 max and we will tell you why that's important. But it's also, what is your fat oxidation? How many grams per minute of fat can you oxidize and over what power range? And what is the shape of your curve? And we benchmark this against like athletes. So Inigo's given us data, right? So here's the guy who won the Tour de France. Here's a master's athlete. Here's somebody with metabolic syndrome. And where do you stack up? So you can really start to see how you oxidize fat and how many watts per kilo you can put out at zone 2 compared to these varying degrees of spectrum. So now all of a sudden, I'm not just saying, here's your glucose and here's your insulin and here's your triglyceride levels, but I think this is a much more important test because of its functionality.
Right. It does require a lot of humility though, and you have to play the long game with it. And most people it's just, what's your 2-year plan? They're like, well, I want to do this race in a month or 3 months or something like that. Like, you really have to be patient with it.
Yeah. And again, it fits so well into the centenarian decathlon because, if you could be in your 80s and by the way, it is theoretically possible to be in your 80s and still put out 2 watts per kilo.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are examples of people who do this. I think Inigo has coached one guy. He's an 81-year-old, so he's a world champion at Masters 81. He's about 2.9 or 3 watts per kilo.
Wow.
Can you imagine that?
We had a guy in here recently, Mike Fremont. He's 100, and he owns all these world records at half marathon and marathon distance running when he was like 90 and 91. It's amazing that he's able to do that. Talk a little bit about the importance of polarity training. Like you talked about the different energy systems in the context of longevity. So this idea of, Z2 and Z5, because what I see, and I'm sure you see this all the time, is people who spend the vast majority of their training time in that gray zone where they're not going slow enough to develop their aerobic capacity, their mitochondrial efficiency and density, and they're not going hard enough to really reap the benefits of strength, power, et cetera.
Yeah, the no man's land, the garbage training. It's an important zone, by the way, depending on your sport. Like when I was time trialing, we had to spend a lot of time at 3-4 crossover because that's basically where you were racing for a 20K time trial. So you had to spend some time there, but not too much time there, right? So, I would say 80%, I was probably only spending 70. I think in retrospect, I should have been spending a little bit more time there.
And at your peak, what was your zone 2 threshold watts?
275.
That's pretty good.
At 75 kilos.
Yeah.
So it was okay.
And for context, for people that are listening or watching, like a Tour de France rider is probably a little above 300, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, but much lighter than me, right? So he would be 320 watts zone 2. Right. So the best of the best would be, but they'd be, 65
weighing
kilos.
It at, 140 pounds.
Yeah, exactly. I was 275 watts for zone 2 at 75 kilos at my best. And a better, but not a very high FTP, right? So that was, my FTP was only 310.
As a time trialer, though, that becomes important.
Yeah, for me, because I was a Merck's time trialist, which is such a silly little niche thing, it really, the arbitrage on Merck's time trialing became to your CDA. It's like coefficient of drag times frontal surface area. Like that was my obsession. That's why I was so obsessed with it. It was like just figuring out because it wasn't so much that my FTP wasn't that high, it's that I could hold that at an uncomfortable position. Because in a time trial, you're in such a compromised position from a vascular return standpoint that if I could hold 300 watts in a tuck and really minimize my frontal surface area and coefficient of drag, I could go fast enough.
You're such a geek. I can't imagine.
Oh,
the amount of data.
every single day, I would come home from Fiesta Island and calculate based on barometric pressure, based on density, like what was my CDA today? Like, did I get down to 0.21?
How do you have time for anything else? That's like a job.
There's a reason I don't do it anymore.
Yeah, right.
Like it was a huge commitment to be able to do that. And, I made a joke about this once. I was like, it kind of occurred to me like how little anybody in the world cared. Like one day I was having dinner with my wife and I was like, do you know what my PR is for 20K? Just out of curiosity. Rich, she was off by a factor of 2. Like literally couldn't care less. And I was like, that's cool. I get it. It's amazing how much I care about this dumb thing that no human on the planet cares about, which is fine. There are a lot of things to this day I care about. Like I love precision shooting. So it's like to be able to shoot a dinner plate a mile away is such an important thing to me. It serves no functional purpose on this planet.
Yeah, and all the F1 stuff, right?
Yeah,
Which is like, we could talk about that later. And that's a whole sidetrack.
But I think, because I'm an engineer, I just think engineers like data. And I really viewed time trialing as purely an engineering problem. Because it's not, if you think about other types of bike racing, there's strategy involved. There's nuance, there's complexity. But time trialing is purely an engineering problem.
Right. The bike is the perfect instrument to extract data from. A watt is a watt is a watt.
Yep.
And basically it becomes this perfect situation for self-experimentation.
Yeah, so cool.
It's crazy. Which is interesting. I know that I saw that you posted you were going to get like a GPS watch, and you kind of put it out on Twitter, like, which watch should I get?
Oh, yeah.
And you made it very clear that you didn't want a heart rate strap. And I was like, that's very antithetical to your whole thing, because wrist heart rate is terrible.
Exactly.
Like, why would you not?
So you'll love this story, right? So the reason I didn't want a chest strap is because I only want it for rucking. And when you're rucking, you got a 60-pound thing on your back, and it's uncomfortable to have a chest strap when you've got so much weight, because you're stacking.
But there's nothing comfortable about it. How much more uncomfortable are you going to be
point.
to get that pristine data?
But it was also like, I didn't want one more dumb thing.
Right.
So what did I do? I end up buying 4 of these watches and keep cycling through them, only to realize that wrist-based heart rate sucks.
It's terrible. It doesn't matter which brand you're wearing.
Sucks.
It's just the technology.
So then I returned them all and got the cheapest one money could buy, the Coros Pace 2 for $200.
It's a good watch, though.
It's fine. And then I use on the bike, I use a Wahoo armband, and that's what I use now.
Right.
So now I exercise with the Wahoo armband and this watch. So I defaulted into what everybody told me from the beginning.
Got it. All right. Well, we're starting to fray at the edges here, but let's kind of put a pin on the zone 2, zone 5 thing in terms of.
Well, I didn't answer your question. Actually,
we're still in the midst of that.
So I would say if you're training for a specific sport, you're going to have to understand what zone you need to be in and spend the appropriate time there. But if you're talking about health, I think you're talking 90% is zone 2. 90 to 95, 5 to 10% is zone 5. Mm-hmm. That's about it. Mm-hmm. So I do 1 VO2 max workout a week. That's it.
Yeah. And you're constantly pricking yourself and, figuring out where your zones are. But for the person who's listening, who might not have access to a lab where they can go and actually do this properly.
Well, a point of care lactate device is all you really need, right? So you can, I use something called, I think it's called the Lactate Plus. So you can, buy these things online. They're not cheap. The device is probably $200-$300. And the strips are probably $2 a piece. So
but how do you administer the protocol when you're actually doing the thing? Like,
well, remember, zone 2, you're not dying, right? So,
right, but you still have to go through all the zones to establish.
Yeah, so it's empirical. I mean, the first few times I did it, it took me a while to be like, oh, I'm well below. Whoops, I overshot. Okay, back off. So I would just have a table next to me set up. And the biggest challenge actually is that you have to have soapy rags there, because lactate doesn't wash off with alcohol. So you'll contaminate the whole thing if your hands aren't clean.
Nobody's going to do this. I know you do, but the protocol that I've typically done in a lab, and maybe it's different from yours, is you get on a bike, you warm up for a while at maybe 100 watts, and then you basically launch into this interval workout.
Yeah.
Every 4 minutes, you increase the wattage like 10 watts.
So we do longer
watts.
intervals because of the lag between lactate in the plasma and in the interstitial. So we'll do 6 to 8 minute intervals. And we'll just have somebody, when our patients go and do the testing, it's a prick to the ear to get the lactate.
Right.
But here's the other thing that
so
you
it's
can
heart rate, power, lactate, and perceived effort.
Right. So we try to triangulate on those. So if I'm telling a patient to do this at home, what I'm basically saying is, here's where I think you're going to be. So the first thing I'm asking is, what's your resting lactate? Tell me that. So when you wake up and you haven't eaten anything, what's your lactate? If that's 2, then you're metabolically so unhealthy. Then we're not doing lactate testing in you. We're going to do it all off RPE, purely. That's it. But let's assume you tell me, my morning lactate is 1. Great. Okay, so then I'm going to say, do you know your actual your actual max heart rate? Not predicted, but truly achieved. So you tell me that. Then I figure out how fit you are just by a few questions. The fitter you are, typically the higher a percentage is. So your zone 2 can be as high as 84, 85% of your max heart rate if you're really fit. If you're not, it's probably closer to 75%. So then I tell them, okay, your heart rate's probably going to be here. And then I don't even try to predict watts. So then I say, okay, I want you to get on the bike and I want you to ride in slow increments until heart rate is about here and your RPE is such that you can talk, but you don't want to.
RPE, rate of perceived
exertion. Yeah.
Exertion.
So then I would just say, just do that for 45 minutes and then do a quick lactate check. And if they do that and it's 1.6, I say, great. The next in 2 days or the next day, I want you to go out and do it, and I want you to add 5 to 10 watts.
Mm-hmm.
And if you come out and you're 2.5, back off by 10 watts. So we don't try to answer it all in one day, but you can answer this question over a period of a week.
Right. And how is the adherence with your patients when you tell them, okay, your heart rate is not allowed to go over X, and they go out for a walk, and the minute there's the slightest incline or they want to put a little bit of kick into anything they're doing, they're out of zone 2, and they're like, well, this is...
I try to keep them separate. So I've actually found outdoor walking and outdoor running to be very difficult for zone 2. So just like when I go rucking, I mean, my heart rate is, sometimes I'll hit max heart rate if I'm on a steep enough hill. So I just consider that a separate form of exercise.
But like a stationary bike.
As uninteresting as it is, I mean, I'm on a stationary bike when I do it because I can control it. And we try to have patients do it on a treadmill, stationary bike, rowing machine. Super controlled. Swimming is good too because you can really control your pace. But outdoor cycling and outdoor walking, running are hard.
Too many variables.
So we don't want to discourage people from doing those things, but we just want to acknowledge, use those for maybe where you get your zone 5.